Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. Today, we're going to jump into the life and crimes of John Wesley Robinson, an American serial killer from way back in the early 1900s. We've got newspaper articles, court documents, all sorts of stuff from back in the day, which, it's like we're looking right through a window into the past.
Yeah, it's really amazing to see how different things were back then compared to now. The whole system of crime and punishment, it was a different world.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And speaking of a different world, we don't have a whole lot on Robinson's early life. The sources are kind of quiet on his childhood, so what do we know?
Not much, unfortunately. It seems most of the records just focus on the crimes themselves, but we do know he was born in Nashville, Tennessee, back in 1867.
1867, okay. So not a lot to go on there. But things get pretty dark pretty quickly in 1896 with the murder of Ella Jones. And this is really where we start to see this pattern of, well, unsettling behavior.
Yeah, absolutely. This first murder is just brutal. It starts with an argument like most do, probably accusations of infidelity. He accuses her, she accuses him right back, and then boom.
And the way he killed her is just, it's chilling. He strangles her. But then, like to be extra sure, shoves a wet sponge down her throat. I mean, that's a detail that just sticks with you.
Right. And it's not just about the violence itself, but the fact that he went that extra step. It implies a level of planning, a real coldness that makes this case stand out.
Yeah, definitely. And then after that, there's the cover-up, right? He tries to hide the body, buries it right in his kitchen floor, even confesses to the police at first. But then this other guy, James Temples, comes into the picture and muddies the waters.
Oh, yeah, Temples. His testimony throws a real wrench in the whole thing because he claims that Robinson had actually tried to strangle him on a separate occasion and even suggests that maybe he was the one who shoved that sponge down Ella Jones' throat.
Wait, hold on. So was Robinson even acting alone? It makes you wonder. In the end, Robinson pleads guilty to second-degree murder, gets 15 years. Which, I mean, even back then, people were outraged. They felt it was way too light of a sentence.
Yeah, and that reaction, it really says a lot about how much times have changed. Back then, 15 years for a murder, even a brutal one, it wasn't totally uncommon. But these days, that kind of sentence would be unheard of.
It makes you wonder if that seemingly light sentence had anything to do with what happened next. So Robinson gets paroled after 11 years, right? Moves to Kansas City, starts a new life, marries a woman named Mary Felton, who has an 11-year-old daughter, Alma.
And tragically, this new life is, well, it's pretty short-lived. And sadly, this is where the violence really escalates. In 1913, both Mary and Alma become his victims.
And it's a lot more brutal this time, right? It's not just strangulation, but he dismembers their bodies, even tries to burn some of the remains. That's a whole new level of, I don't know, depravity.
It definitely suggests a higher level of premeditation, the dismemberment, the burning. It all points to him trying to really hide the evidence, which, back then was a lot easier to get away with. No fancy forensics like we have today.
And the way he disposed of the bodies, it took weeks before anyone even found them. It's almost like something out of a scary story or something.
It just goes to show how different investigations were back then. Think about it. No DNA testing, no advanced forensics. They're basically working in the dark.
Right. Totally different resources. And then comes the capture, right? He confesses almost immediately. But then, this is where things get weird again. He tries to blame it on Mary Felton's half-sister, Jenny Hill, claims she was in on it.
This is where we start to see this manipulative side of him. First he confesses, then there's that whole thing with Temple. Now he's trying to drag someone else into it. It's like he's trying to control the narrative, shift the blame, avoid being fully accountable.
Right. And if that wasn't enough, we have another woman, Fannie Taylor, who comes forward and says that she thinks Robinson might have killed another wife years before in Nashville. So now we're wondering, like, how many victims are we really talking about here?
Yeah, and that accusation, while never definitively proven, it kind of hanging over the whole case. Makes you question how much we really know about John Wesley Robinson and just how far his crimes may have gone.
Like, we're only seeing we took at the iceberg. And then the trial itself becomes this huge spectacle, right? Like the whole city's caught up in it. The judge even has to clear the courtroom at one point because people are so riled up. They're worried about riots breaking out.
It just goes to show the impact of these crimes, the way they gripped the public. This wasn't just some isolated incident. It really shook the community to its core.
And just when you think you've got the story figured out, Robinson flips again. Admits he made the whole thing up about Jenny Hill. Why would he do that? Why bring her into it at all? It's baffling.
It is, and it's one of the most perplexing things about the whole case. Throughout his interactions with the law, he just kept doing this, confessing and then implicating others, then recanting. It's like he's constantly changing his story. But why? Is he just trying to throw everyone off his trail, deflect blame, or is it something deeper, something psychological?
That's like trying to solve a puzzle, but the pieces keep changing shape on you. They do a psychiatric evaluation on him, and it suggests that he might have, well, a low intellectual capacity. But even so, they deny his petition for clemency, and he's sentenced to death. It's kind of interesting that they even considered his mental state back then, you know?
It does show that even back then, people were starting to recognize that mental capacity could play a role in criminal justice. But our understanding of those issues has come a long way since then.
Absolutely, yeah. And get this, now we're talking about the final hours leading up to the execution. And this is where things get really strange. Instead of being scared or, remorseful, Robinson is incredibly calm. He's actually cracking jokes with the guards, almost like he's totally at peace with it all.
It's such a strange juxtaposition. Here's this man who committed these horrific acts, yet he's completely composed as he faces his own death. Makes you wonder, was it an act? Some way to exert control one last time? Or was there something more going on?
It's almost impossible to know for sure. And then his last meal request, well, that's odd too. 2 cups of coffee and an orange. That's it. No big feast, no last indulgences. Not exactly what you'd expect from a hardened killer.
It's definitely an unexpected choice. It almost adds to the mystery of John Wesley Robinson. Was it genuine remorse? Or just plain indifference? It's just one more detail that keeps people fascinated by this case, even today.
And then comes the final act. He's on the gallows, about to be executed, and he delivers what's described as a really impressive sermon, urging people to turn away from sin. So was it genuine? Was this, true repentance in his final moments? Or was it another act, another manipulation?
That's question what people still debate today. Was it a real spiritual awakening or just a calculated attempt to save face? It's something that sticks with you long after you've learned about his story.
Like a final question mark hanging over the whole thing. And it leads to even more questions, which is what makes these deep dives so fascinating, right? But before we get into all that, we need to take a quick break. We'll be back in a minute to talk about how this case might have played out in a different time, in a different world. Okay, so we've gone through John Wesley Robinson's life and crimes, but what if we take a step back, look at it all through a modern lens? Like, how might things have gone down if this all happened today?
Oh, that's a great question. I mean, just think about all the advancements in forensic science, psychology. We would have such a different understanding of the crime scenes, of Robinson's mental state. The whole picture would be different.
Right, we're talking DNA evidence, psychological profiles. It would be a whole new ballgame.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, DNA alone could have proven his involvement right away, maybe even linked him to other crimes we don't even know about.
And we talked about that psychiatric evaluation, right? The one that said he had a low intellectual capacity. How do you think a modern assessment would have changed things? Like his sentencing, for example.
Well, that's a really tricky one because today we approach mental illness and intellectual disability so much differently. A modern evaluation might have, it could have led to a completely different outcome for him.
So we're looking at the same puzzle, but with a whole different set of pieces, and we can't really ignore the elephant in the room here. Race. It obviously played a huge role back then. It's hard to imagine that didn't impact the whole case. The public perception, the media, even the legal proceedings.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. I mean, we're talking about the early 1900s, a time of intense racial prejudice. To think that a black man accused of these crimes wouldn't have faced bias, both obvious and subtle, within the justice system and society itself, it's just not realistic. And it's a reminder of how far we've come in terms of racial equality, but also how much further we still have to go.
It adds this whole other layer of complexity to this story. So here we are trying to piece together this puzzle from the past. We've got, societal context, advancements in criminal justice, and this incredibly complicated figure at the center of it all.
It's a story that really makes you think. John Wesley Robinson, he challenges us to examine our own ideas about justice, about responsibility, about what it means to be human, really.
And it's not just about him as an individual. It makes you think about how the whole system of justice has evolved and how society, influences the way we perceive and deal with crime.
It's all connected. We can't just look at this case in isolation. It's a reminder that that history is not just some set of facts and dates. It's a living tapestry, full of human stories, both good and bad. And it's by exploring these stories that we really learn about ourselves and the world we live in.
It's a constant reminder that learning is a journey. It's not about, having all the answers. It's about constantly peeling back layers, seeing things from different angles.
And sometimes, yeah, those layers just lead to more questions. But that's part of what makes it so interesting, right? It's that search for understanding, even when things are ambiguous, that's where the real value lies.
It's about actively engaging with the past, not just, passively observing it. And that's what we want you to do. Take what we've talked about today, all these pieces of the puzzle, and keep digging.
Because real understanding doesn't come from just accepting what you're told. It comes from asking questions, challenging assumptions, and forming your own conclusions.
And speaking of challenging assumptions, I want to leave you with one last thought. Okay, imagine you're sitting on the jury during John Wesley Robinson's trial. You've heard everything, all the testimony, the conflicting stories, knowing what we know about him, about his background, his mental state, about the times he lived in. What would your verdict be?
That's a question that goes beyond just guilt or innocence. It forces you to really think about your own values, your beliefs about justice, about mercy. What does it mean to hold someone accountable for their actions?
There's no easy answer. But that's the point, right? It's that struggle with the question, that weighing of the evidence. That's where the power of this whole thing lies.
It's about using history not just to look back, but to look ahead, to better understand ourselves and the world around us.
It's like we've opened this puzzle box, and inside there's another one, and another. Each one with more questions, more things that just don't quite add up.
Yeah, it's a great way to put it. John Wesley Robinson, he's still a mystery. Even after all these years, all the research, we can look at the facts, the evidence, try to understand the times he lived in. But there's something about him we may never truly grasp.
And maybe that's what keeps us coming back to these stories, right? He's not just a monster. He's more complicated than that. He makes us think about the gray areas of human behavior.
Absolutely. And it reminds us that history, it's not always a clear-cut story. It's messy, it's full of twists and turns, and people who just don't fit into neat little boxes.
So as we wrap up our deep dive into John Wesley Robinson, I think it's important to remember that this isn't just about him. It's about the bigger questions his story brings up.
Yeah, those big, timeless questions about good and evil, about mental illness and how it plays into crime, about how society reacts to these kinds of events, questions that are still relevant today.
And by looking at these questions through the lens of history, through this one specific case, we're hoping to give you, the listener, a better understanding not just of the past, but of the present, too.
Because history, it's not just dates and names in a book. It's a living thing, It shapes who we are, where we're going.
So, as a final thought, I want you to think about this. Imagine John Wesley Robinson's case happening today. What would be different? What new questions would we ask? What new angles would we consider?
And most importantly, what can we learn from this journey into the past, from all the darkness, all the complexities we've encountered along the way?
We hope this deep dive has, given you some things to think about, maybe sparked your curiosity a bit. And hey, maybe even left you with more questions than answers. That's okay. That's part of the process. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking those questions, and keep diving deep.